All right, just by way of reminder, from 2 weeks ago, we started with a definition, generally speaking, of what one would read when reading online about the rapture. And just by way of reminder, we pulled all the passages that we're going to deal with from about 5 primary websites, those that were not, for example, none that, as far as I can tell, are privately owned websites. In other words, they're websites that represent groups, religious groups, and of that type. And we noted that there was a cycle of passages that continued to recur through the number or the numerous websites that we looked at. And these two in particular, 1 Thessalonians 4 and 1 Corinthians 15. And we noted by definition that by the definition of those that believe in it, that the rapture is a secret catching away. And then we looked at the two passages that are most oftentimes cited in respect to the idea that the Bible teaches such a thing as the rapture. And we noted that in 1 Thessalonians 4 and 1 Corinthians 15, that we have language that doesn't indicate anything remotely akin to a secret. There's the descending with a shout, the voice of the archangel, the trumpet of God. Of course, a trumpet was a loud instrument that was used, and still even to this day is used, to make some type of announcement or to gain people's attention. And so we have these three descriptions in 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 16, and we added with the voice of the archangel the voice of the two angels in Isaiah 6, where they shouted, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God of Sabaoth." And it says that the very foundations of the temple of God shook at the sound of their voice. And so how powerful and how loud that voice was, and what would the voice of the archangel sound like if it's announcing the coming of Jesus Christ? And so these phrases, in other words, these things that are found in the Bible cannot be reconciled with the man-made idea of a secret catching away. And then we noted 1 Corinthians 15, 51 to 54, and these are the phrases that they zero in on. In a moment and in the twinkling of an eye. Now, nobody disputes the time frame or the timing of the event. We all understand when the Lord comes, it's going to be an instant. I mean, it's not like there's some kind of big build-up that we're looking for, some type of crescendo until you get to the end of the verse. That in a very instant it's going to take place, and the earth is going to be dissolved, and the earth and all the works that are therein are going to be burned up, 2 Peter 3 and verse 9. So this moment and in the twinkling of an eye refers to the change. We're going to be changed. There's no question. We're going to be changed. Those of us that are alive and remain will be changed. As will those who have long since been dead. They'll be changed. Number one, their body will have to be reconstituted. Right? Because the flesh is going to put on the spirit. So those that have been dead for a long time, whose bodies may very well, in fact, be scattered to the four corners of the earth. I mean, you think about, how far could a person's body go that died at sea? I mean, especially over the course of 100 or 500 or 1,000 years, because, when that body begins to decay, and especially if it's, say, a body that died at sea, maybe in wartime, and I don't even mean like World War II. What about those that, 400 or 500 years ago in the Spanish Armada? What happened to their bodies? Eaten by fish and various creatures, and the body itself carried to the four corners of the ocean, and then yet that fish might have been caught by somebody and eaten. Catherine's like, "Ooh, that sounds gross." Well, I guess it's a good thing. You don't eat catfish, do you? You do? Well, don't think about what catfish eat while they're sitting at the bottom of Wheeler Dam, because it's disgusting. But then somebody might catch that fish and eat that fish, and then he might move halfway around the world and live and die, and then his body decays, and then some tree. Some tree uses that body for food. I mean, you see how this thing never ends, and how far our bodies could literally go over the course of hundreds or thousands of years. And yet the Bible says God's going to bring back every single body is going to be raised. That means it's going to be reconstituted. And then it's going to put on incorruption. So we all understand we're all going to be resurrected. We're all going to be changed, no matter living or dead, no matter what the time frame is. That is an established fact, and we're not arguing that. The problem is that these things refer to the change in our bodies and not to some kind of secret snatching away. Because they forget to read the last part of the verse, which says, at the last trumpet. This change is going to take place at the last trumpet. This one right here that we've just noted. And so we noted that this phraseology is the how, or the speed. This phraseology is the when, at the last trumpet. And then we went back in 1 Corinthians, in the same chapter, to verses 20 through 23 and 24. And at the end of verse 23, speaking of the second coming of Christ, it says, at his coming, then comes the end. And then at the end of that time, or at that time, he's going to deliver up the kingdom to the Father. He's not going to come back and establish a kingdom. He's going to come back and give it back to God, because he's already in possession of that kingdom. And so we have these. And you could add, if you wanted to, and we noted this about 3 or 4 weeks ago, in the various kingdom errors associated with this, that the church itself is not the kingdom, and that the kingdom is yet in the future, going to be a physical, earthly kingdom. Daniel 2:44 and Daniel 7:13 and 14. Christ is now reigning in his kingdom. He is King of kings and Lord of lords. And so we noted all of these things, that the very phraseology does not permit for the idea of some type of secret catching away, and whatever takes place when Jesus comes back, that's the end. That's the end of all things. But now I want us to think about Matthew 24. I made mention of this a week or two ago about Billy Graham was well known for preaching the idea that Matthew 24 is knocking at the door. And who did we say wrote a song about it? Johnny Cash, that's right. Johnny Cash, at Billy Graham's behest, wrote a song called Matthew 24 is knocking at the door. But there's some words that we need to study, and some phrases in Matthew 24 that would be helpful to us in determining whether or not Matthew 24 is talking about some type of secret catching away, or if it's talking at all about the end of time. All right? Now, look in toward the end of that chapter to about verse 35. All right? We're going to go to about verse 35. Somebody read for me verse 35. All right, then that's not the one I'm looking for. Give me verse 34, or 33 and 34.
Likewise you shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled.
All right, there we go. That's what I wanted. That's what I wanted. Now let's look at the passages themselves. What do the passages say? Verse 33, it says, when you do what? When you see all these things. All right? All right? You'll know what? He is near at the door. When you see all these things, does it say you will know? Is that what it says, Father? Yeah, you will know. Or when you see all these things, know. Know it is near, even at the door. That's where your Matthew 24 is knocking at the door phrase comes from. All right? Now, verse 34. What do we find? Read that one.
This generation will not pass away until all these things take place.
All right? This generation will not pass until when?
All these things take place.
All these things. Now, I have another color marker. I do. Now, it would be logical to connect those two phrases, wouldn't it? From one verse to the next. Whatever he says, you're going to see in the things that you're going to see in verse 33. And this generation will not pass till all these things take place. So these things in verse 34 and these things in verse 33 refer to the same things. Is that right? I mean, that's the only reasonable conclusion to draw. All right? So note this. When you see all these things, the you of verse 33 is the same as this generation of the verse 34. Does that make sense? So who's he talking to? Who are you talking to, Derek?
Folks right there.
Those people standing right there. When you see all these things. Now, these things refers back to, and I'll just to set it in the verse context, goes all the way back to verse 4 to verse really 31. See, how do I want to connect these? Just to break up the color monotony. We're getting close to Christmas, so let's use red and green. How's that? Matthew 24, 5 to 31. All the signs that Jesus listed, and they are manifold. I mean, there's a bunch of them. False Christs will arise. There'll be famine and pestilences and wars and rumors of wars. And there'll be, in about verse 15, the abomination of desolation that Daniel prophesied about. These are all the things that are in these things. In other words, all the things that I've talked about in the verses leading up to these two verses. All these things you will see. This generation will not pass. Now, I just want to make it clear in our understanding of this generation. I'm going to go out this side anyway. All right, this generation. All right? Now, Matthew uses this generation 5 times. It appears 5 times in Matthew. All right? Now, the reason it's important for us to focus on this phrase, this generation, is that in 1948, and I believe it was in the month of May, 1948, the United Nations and the rest of the world came together to reestablish a physical nation of Israel. All right? A few of us, a very few of us, are old enough to remember that. Now, I'm not impugning Miss Beulah or Miss Grace, but they're old enough to remember that. All right? They weren't very old, but they ought to be old enough to remember the end of World War II. Do y'all remember that? Now, I'm asking you because I wasn't there. All right? I'm asking you, was it a big deal when they reestablished the nation of Israel in 1948? Do you remember it being a big deal? Not really? See, and I don't remember seeing a lot about it either. All right? But later on, guys like Hal Lindsey from Dallas Theological Seminary, who wrote the book that sold probably 100 million copies, The Late Great Planet Earth, they latched on to 1948. And they said within 40 years, because they said a generation is 40 years. So within 40 years of the reestablishment of the nation of Israel, all of this is going to take place. In other words, from 1948 to 1988, by the way, there was also a book written in the late 70s or early 80s called 88 Reasons Jesus is Going to Come in 1988. 88 Reasons Why Jesus is Coming in 1988. And it all hinged on this generation equaling 40 years, which that is the standard, that's the standard understanding of the phrase generation. 40 years. So 40 years, you got 1948, you got Israel reestablished. Israel reestablished, plus 40 is 1988. And it was about during this time that Hal Lindsey and all those people went berserk, writing their books about the end of the world. All right? Well, what happened in 1988? Derek?
Well, the world didn't end, that's for sure.
In respect to this, what happened in 1988? Nothing. Nothing. Unfortunately for Hal Lindsey, he was still alive. So you know what he did? He readjusted his idea of what a generation was and said, well, a generation can be as long as 100 years. Which was convenient because by the time the 100 rolls around, Hal Lindsey going to be dead. Right? He going to be dead. So he just readjusted his idea of what a generation was till after the time that he was dead. Now, the Lord can come back before 2048, right? I mean, He can come back before, because that's 100 years from then, right? But if the Lord lets the world stand till 2048, what's going to happen in 2048 in regard to this? The same thing that happened in 1988. I mean, I don't know any simpler way to put it. All right? So, this generation. Now, I want to look at how Matthew uses the term. Because how he would use the term would be consistent through his use, his writing in his book. So, if we can establish a pattern that Matthew would use in his use of the word this generation, then it would serve as a help to us in understanding who Jesus is talking about when he says this generation in Matthew 24. So let's open up our Bibles, all right? Let's open up our Bibles and look at the phrase this generation. And let's start with Matthew 11, 16 to 19. Matthew 11, 16 to 19. This is Jesus talking and Matthew recording. Unto what shall I liken this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplace and calling to their companions, saying, we played the flute for you and you did not dance. We mourned to you and you did not lament. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon. But the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a winebibber, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is justified by her children. All right, so to whom is Jesus referring in Matthew 11, 16 to 19 when he said this generation? Who was he referring to?
These people right there.
Jews living right then. Jews living right then. And we know this because he said, you saw John the Baptist.
They had to see him, know who he was, see him.
That's right. They had to know who he was, know his character, know his demeanor, know that, look, John the Baptist was a strange cat.
Everybody knew.
All right? He ate locusts and wild honey, and he wore a coat of camel hair. You know, he was an odd fellow. In other words, he was out of the ordinary. And they said, he has a demon because of what he does. And then Jesus says, I come doing the very opposite of what John did, which ought to make you happy. Because you don't like what John did. I'm doing the opposite, but now you don't like what I do. You said he has a demon, and you say I'm a glutton and a drunkard. In other words, you can't be satisfied. But who's he talking to? Jews living right then. All right, let's turn to the next chapter. Chapter 12, verse 33. Now there's a context here that begins in verse 33 and goes through verse 45. All right? Let's go to verse 41. The men of Nineveh will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and indeed a greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and indeed a greater than Solomon is here. Verse 43, 44, and 45. When an unclean spirit goes out of a man, he goes through dry places, seeking rest and finds none. Then he says, I'll return to my house from which I came. And he comes and finds it empty, swept, and put in order. Then he goes and takes with him 7 other spirits more wicked than himself, and they enter and dwell there. And the last state of that man is worse than the first. So shall it also be with this wicked generation. 3 times this generation is found in this text. Of whom does Jesus speak in Matthew 12? Get a better pen. My pen's laying down on me. Matthew 12. We picked up in what verse? 41 through 45. All right? 3 times. 3 times in Matthew 12, 41 to 45. Who is Jesus talking about when he said this generation? Jews living right then. Jews living right then. This generation. All right, let's go to Matthew 23. #29 to 36. All right, in verse 29, Jesus is in the midst of a series of what we call woe statements. Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, and hypocrites. All right? Who's he talking to when he says that? People living right then, right? All right? So now we get to verse 34, because I'm just trying to skip some of the reading. Go to verse 34. Indeed, I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you'll kill and crucify. Some of them you'll scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Bechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Assuredly, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Now, let me ask you a question. Now, we already know the answer to my next question, right? My next question is, who was Jesus referring to in verse number 36 when he said, all these things will come upon this generation? Who was he talking about? Jews living right then. Jews living right then. But I want to roll back a couple of verses to verse 34 and ask this question. Did the things in verse 34 come to pass in the days of that generation?
Yeah, that was way back.
No, in verse 34.
Yeah, oh yes. He said, I will send them to you, and that's what you're going to do.
All right. I will send you prophets, wise men, and scribes. So these are things that's fixing to happen. He says, some of them you'll kill and crucify. By the way, crucifixion was a form of punishment that was developed under the Roman system and practiced during the days of Rome. Question. Did they scourge? Did they kill and crucify? Did the Jews kill and crucify some of the people that were sent to them? One in particular, the Lord. What about Peter? Peter was crucified. That word is not exactly used, but Jesus described it, and Peter understood it, that he himself would be crucified. Josephus records that there was a scarcity of lumber in and around Jerusalem because of the number of crosses that had been built to kill Christians. So that came true, right? Some of them you will kill and crucify. Let me ask you this. Did it also come to pass that they would scourge some in their synagogues? Did they persecute Jews in their synagogues? Or did the Jews persecute people in the synagogues? Question. Did they persecute Paul? When did Paul create a ruckus? When he was preaching Christ in the synagogues. Isn't that right? He had a custom of going to the synagogues to preach Christ to the Jews. And as Alan Hires is fond of saying, there was either a riot or a revival, and sometimes both. Right? So that came true. Question. Last line in that verse. Did the Jews persecute Christians and righteous people from city to city? Was Paul also among that number? On that first missionary journey, did he not flee from one city and go to Lystra? And the Jews came from Antioch to Lystra and stoned him. The Jews that stoned him at Lystra weren't even from Lystra. They had chased him from one city to the next. By the way, did Paul himself say that he persecuted Christians unto strange cities? Did Paul himself, before he became a Christian, persecute Christians and chase them from city to city? He did. And all this took place within one generation. All right? So, 3 times, actually 5 times, but in 3 texts recorded by Matthew, Jesus speaks of this generation, this generation, this generation. And it refers every single time to Jews living right then. So now, when we get to Matthew 24 and to verse 34, and Jesus said, all these things will take place before this generation passes. Well, it's obvious he's talking about people living in 1948. Right? That's who he's talking to. He's talking to people that were living in 1948. Or sometime in the next 100 years after 1948. It's obvious, right? That's who he's talking about. Or is he talking about Jews living right then? Obviously, we know the answer to that question. He was talking to Jews living right then. So everything that is found in Matthew 24, 5 to 31 would take place within 40 years of Jesus making that statement right before he was crucified. I'm going to give you one more thing. Let's go back to Matthew 24 and go to verse 14. I found this one interesting. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to use the verse. I'm going to tell you an interesting thing that I heard even this morning. What's going to happen before the end comes, according to Matthew 24:14? This gospel will be preached in all the world. And then what? The end will come. Question. Was the gospel preached in all the world? Matthew 24:14. And I'm going to do it this way. Gospel preached worldwide. In that generation. That's where I was going, Bobby. That's exactly where I was going. Matthew 24:14 is right smack in the middle of verses 5 to 31. And it had to be done. When would this have to take place? In this generation. Was the gospel preached to the whole world before that generation was up? Indeed it was. Look at Colossians chapter 1, verse 6. Somebody read me Colossians 1 verse 6 out loud so everybody can hear it. Say something about the gospel which has come unto you.
Which has come unto you as it is in all the world.
There you go. The gospel which has come to you in Colossae, as it is where?
In all the world.
All the world. Skip down the same chapter to verse 23. Good enough, right there, Miss Judy. The gospel which was preached to you and to who else? Every creature under heaven. The gospel was preached to the whole world within one generation of the death of Christ. And by the way, if you needed further evidence of that fact, Paul said the gospel was preached to the whole world. Their sound has gone to the ends of the earth and into the whole world. Talking about preaching the gospel. Verse 60 says, but they've not all obeyed the gospel. Then he asks the question, have they not all heard? Yes, they've all heard. It's not that they haven't obeyed because they haven't heard, because their sound went forth to the ends of the world, or the ends of the earth and into all the world. So the gospel was preached worldwide in that generation. Therefore, Everything. Everything.
Todd, there's one section there that I'd like to ask you to explain, and it's right at verse 30 and 31.
All right.
Because it's talking about, it seems like he changes gears, so there's 2-3 verses there that
29, 30, and 31 is as apocalyptic as anything you'll ever read. The sun be turned to darkness and all the apocalyptic language of verses 29 to 31.
and there'll be a great setting of trouble.
That's right. Now, I don't know if I've got it in front of me. I do not. Wait a minute. All right, look at let me see if this passage in Ezekiel is the one I'm looking for. All right. Ezekiel 32. In Ezekiel 32, and beginning in verse number 2, there is a prophecy against the Pharaoh who is the king of Egypt. In verse 3, he says, I'll spread my net over you with a company of many people and draw you up into my net. Now look at verse 6. I will also water the land with the flow of your blood, even to the mountains, and the river beds will be full of you. I'll put out your light, cover the heavens, make the stars dark, cover the sun with a cloud. The moon shall not give her light. All the bright lights of the heavens I will make dark over you and bring darkness upon your land. That's apocalyptic language. The language, and I wish I had printed it because I've got it on my computer, and I'm out of time, but I promise you I'll bring this back to you next Sunday night. There are about 4 or 5 prophecies of the Old Testament that almost match word for word with Matthew 24, verses 29 through 31. About the sun being darkened and the Son of Man coming in the clouds and all those things. The language as is found in Matthew 24 mirrors that in the Old Testament. And when it's used in the Old Testament, it is announcing the destruction of a nation. The utter destruction of a nation. Egypt, Assyria, Babylon. I think there was one more, maybe even Edom. In other words, but God used, in other words, Matthew 24, 29 to 31, Jesus is not making these words up. He's using them intentionally, drawing them out of the Old Testament to tell the Jews, these are words that you're familiar with. These are verses, are concepts that you're familiar with. And when they were given to your forefathers, they announced the utter destruction of nations. Now, I'm using this exact same language and I'm applying it to you. This generation. Because in AD 70, there was the utter destruction of a nation. The nation of Israel. All right? But I'll pull that language, I'll pull those passages out for next week as part of our study. And we'll go, Lord willing, next week we'll enter into the section on Luke 17, on one taken and the other left behind. The other left behind. But fix to ask me about being left behind.
I'm 40 down there.
Yeah, one at the mill, one taken, and the other, 2 men sleeping, one taken.
That's another way Jesus is coming, right? He coming. He got them. If he died, he's coming to get you.
That's true. That is true. But the idea of being left behind, it is somewhat. But what he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, let me add this. In premillennial doctrine, getting left behind is a good or a bad thing? It's bad. But guess what? In the Bible, in Luke 17 and these other passages, getting left behind is a good thing. They got the whole concept of being left behind wrong. Because if you got left behind, you weren't carried away by the Romans and killed. You got to live. And we'll show that in Luke 17 and Matthew 24. Lord willing, next Sunday night. See, now y'all got me fired up. I'm ready to go.
Matthew 25 and 40 and 41.
Now, in Matthew, talking about Matthew 25 or Matthew 24?
25.
Now, Matthew 25 is the great judgment scene.
I thought it kind of felt like one, there was 2 or 3 together, and one was taken away, like he might have died, you know.
No, that's Matthew 24.
What's right here, Matthew? Oh, excuse me. You're absolutely.
Yeah, that's Matthew 20.
Preacher.
No, yeah, that's Matthew 24. Matthew 25 is a great.
What he's talking about? One of them dies, or
He is talking about it, but the one that gets taken is the one that dies.
right.
The one that gets left behind is the one that lives. Whereas in this doctrine, the one that gets taken lives, and the one that gets left behind dies. So they can't even get that part right. But we'll pick up on, and Luke 17 is also in that text 26 through 34, I believe it is. But we'll deal with Derek's question on verses 29 to 31 and the apocalyptic language there, and compare it to Tyre and Babylon and I said Edom, I meant Tyre. Tyre and Egypt and those nations, and then we'll deal with the left behind. We'll deal with the left behind scenario and show how even Jesus' own instructions deny the very idea of a rapture. All right? Any questions about this? All right. If not, I'm going to ask you to be on your feet.